Welcome to Washington Today on C-SPAN Radio for Thursday, July 20th, 2023. Senate Judiciary Committee passes a bill along party lines to require the Supreme Court adopt an ethical code of conduct and reform the rules for disclosures of gifts and recusal from cases where there's a conflict of interest. Coming up, we'll hear from the committee's top Democrat and Republican and talk about today's markup session when amendments are offered with a CQ roll call reporter. Robert F. Kennedy Jr., a Democratic presidential candidate, testifies before the House subcommittee on the weaponization of the federal government at the invitation of the Republican majority, saying his free speech rights on what he saw as potential dangers of the COVID-19 vaccines were censored. Democrats on the subcommittee questioned him about comments he made recently about the vaccine and racial and ethnic minorities. U.S. House passes a 5-year FAA reauthorization bill on a bipartisan vote. One amendment to the bill that failed would have added more flights at Ronald Reagan Washington National Airport. President Joe Biden at a shipbuilding company in Philadelphia talks about creating clean energy union jobs to build offshore wind farms. U.S. Senate passes an amendment to the defense policy bill to prohibit sales from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve to China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran. And the Pentagon says North Korea has not yet responded to inquiries about U.S. Army Private Travis King, who earlier this week ran across the border from South Korea. Now to the Senate Judiciary Committee sending a Supreme Court ethics reform bill to the full Senate. The vote was party line, 11 Democrats voting yes, 10 Republicans voting no. The committee chair, Dick Durbin, Democrat from Illinois, opened the markup by explaining why he believes this bill is needed.
Past several months have seen a steady stream of news reports highlighting ethical failures by the highest court in the land, the Supreme Court justices appointed by both Republican and Democratic presidents. Justice Clarence Thomas traveled the world on billionaire Harlan Crow's yacht and private jet. Crow bought the home of Justice Thomas's mother and allowed her to continue living there rent-free. He even paid for the education of a relative of Justice Thomas. None of this was included in Justice Thomas's financial disclosures. Justice Samuel Alito took an all-expense-paid luxury fishing trip to Alaska. He traveled there on the private jet of billionaire hedge fund manager Paul Singer. He stayed at a fishing lodge of conservative donor Robin Arkley. Like Justice Thomas, Justice Alito did not disclose any of these receipts. In explaining this, Justice Alito said he did not believe he was required to disclose the private jet travel because he was sitting in a seat that would otherwise have been empty. Justice Sonia Sotomayor used her tax-funded court staff to promote additional sales of her books in conjunction with speaking engagements. She failed to recuse herself from cases involving her book publisher. If any of the senators or even the staff members sitting in this room today were involved in similar activities, they would be in violation of the ethical rules that govern Congress. That's because all of us are subject to enforceable codes of conduct that prohibit us from accepting gifts and using taxpayers' funds for personal gain. We are required to make public disclosures about our finances, and there are consequences if we fail to meet these standards. But the same is not true for the 9 justices across the street. Unlike every other federal official, Supreme Court justices are not bound by a code of ethical conduct. They are the most powerful judges in America, and yet they are not required to follow even the most basic ethical standards. The CERT Act we are considering would change that. It would finally require the Supreme Court to adopt an enforceable code of conduct. It would also add new recusal and transparency requirements to federal law. In this way, it would bring all 9 justices of the Supreme Court in line with every other federal judge in America.
Senate Judiciary Committee Chair Dick Durbin, Democrat from Illinois, at today's markup of that bill. He said it was CERT, that stands for Supreme Court Ethics, Recusal, and Transparency Act, sponsored by another member of the committee, Sheldon Whitehouse, Democrat from Rhode Island. The committee's ranking Republican, Lindsey Graham of South Carolina, in his opening statement, said he expected all Republicans on the committee to oppose the bill.
This bill is going nowhere all of us are going to vote no, and I hope you bring it to the floor. I hope we have a spirited debate about what this bill would do to the court. This is not what Senator Cornyn was trying to do. This is legislation that would fundamentally change the way the court operates. The Supreme Court was created by the Constitution. It's a co-equal branch of the government. Our founding fathers decided to create 3 branches of government, and it set up the Supreme Court in the Constitution. All lower courts are created by statute. The bill you have before us would fundamentally erode the power the Supreme Court has enjoyed over time. It would allow lower court justices to dispose of complaints against the court, subpoena the members of the Supreme Court. It would create a complaint body where anybody could file a complaint against the court, and the complaint would be adjudicated by lower court justices, which strikes at the heart of the court being the Supreme Court. Your recusal mechanism, you can't expand the court. Senator Kennedy said something very smart, as he always does yesterday. This bill would shrink the court. There'd be a massive effort by liberals throughout the country to disqualify conservatives in every major case. And the way you handle recusal is that you micromanage how the court must decide when to recuse. The individual justice no longer would have that power. You would give it to other justices. That is a constitutional assault on the power of the court to do business.
Senator Lindsey Graham, Republican from South Carolina, ranking Republican on the Judiciary Committee. The committee reported out the Supreme Court ethics reform bill on a party line vote. Michael Macagnone, CQ Roll Call legal affairs reporter, covered today's markup and joins us now by phone. Thanks for being with us. What specifically would this underlying bill do?
Thank you for having me on. So this bill would do a number of things in sort of 3 main areas. The first is require that the justices adopt a code of conduct that would also have review by a panel of lower court judges, would have them adopt a new set of recusal standards, again, with review by a panel of lower court judges, and require that the Supreme Court adopt new transparency provisions for amicus briefs at the Supreme Court, which are briefs filed by non-parties, advocacy groups, sometimes members of Congress, who want to convince the justices to rule in a certain way.
Senator Graham said that there would be dozens of potential amendments offered today, but only a handful were. What were the subjects? And then secondly, do you know why they didn't offer the others?
Well, first off, there were, by my count, about 8 amendments that were offered, varying on things from expanding Supreme Court police authority to investigate, potential crimes tied to protests outside of the justices' homes, to expanding the federal rules for carrying of firearms to include federal judges, not just federal law enforcement. And as to why there weren't more amendments offered, maybe mercy. There were something like 60 that were filed. But as to a specific reason, I don't know yet, and I have asked around to try and find out.
So the bill came out of committee, now heads to the full Senate. What are the chances there?
Slim to none. There's only been one Republican who's come out and said that they would back a Supreme Court ethics bill, not specifically this one, that is Senator Lisa Murkowski of Alaska. The rest of the Senate's Republicans, particularly Senate leadership, have said no dice, and they don't intend to back it. So it looks very unlikely that they would receive the 9 Republican votes that would be needed to advance the bill.
The Supreme Court could implement its own reforms. Do you know the status of that and how they view this bill?
Well, the Supreme Court is usually a pretty closed shop. It's exceptional when justices comment on anything outside of their cases. So we don't really know what is happening inside the court. The most recent rule change we actually only found out when the Judicial Conference of the United States, the rulemaking body for the court, let a senator know in a letter that they had changed the rules. So it's kind of a black box there as far as what new rule changes might be coming from the court itself.
We're talking with Michael Macagnone from CQ Roll Call. The Senate Democrats who are proposing this are pushing it as a reform issue, as a good government issue. But if such an ethical code of conduct as this bill envisions would be put in place, how could it affect the Supreme Court operations and the cases they take and how they rule on the cases?
Well, it's actually been one of the big criticisms of this bill from Republicans that it would fundamentally change how cases get litigated and brought up to the Supreme Court, because they argue that litigants would be able to then strategically try and pick off justices, either by taking cases that they felt like a justice would have to recuse themselves from, or mining any sort of documents or disclosure that they can find to tie a justice to a party in a particular case, that it would amplify the gamesmanship that already exists in the Supreme Court docket.
If this bill were to become law, is it possible the Supreme Court could rule on its constitutionality?
That might be a question for a law school professor, but there was actually a hearing earlier this year where there were law school professors and lawyers who testified and said that they gave very different answers. Some of them said that they felt like this law would be constitutional, that Congress has regulated the Supreme Court in the past, and others said that it would be found unconstitutional. But in either case, the Supreme Court would be the final word as to whether or not, the ethics law for the Supreme Court would be constitutional.
And finally, when you were in the room during the markup, did anything else strike you, anything interesting in the debate?
Well, anytime court issues come up at the Senate Judiciary Committee, a lot of long memories come out, and sometimes it can resemble the Seinfeld holiday of, I believe it was Festivus, of the airing of grievances that have built up over the years. It's not uncommon to hear recriminations from Supreme Court confirmations in the 1980s or things like that. Today, we heard about sort of a tit for tat going back to the 1990s with Justice Clarence Thomas's confirmation hearings. So there are a lot of old wounds in the Senate Judiciary Committee.
Michael Macagnone is CQ Roll Call legal affairs reporter. Find his stories at rollcall.com and on Twitter at Mike Macagnone. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
This is Washington Today. A story from the New York Times. The Democratic presidential candidate Robert F. Kennedy Jr. came to Capitol Hill on Thursday and pointedly declared that he is neither an anti-Semite nor a racist, while giving a fiery defense of free speech and accusing the Biden administration and his political opponents of trying to silence him. Mr. Kennedy, writes the Times, an environmental lawyer who turned to anti-vaccine activism and has trafficked in conspiracy theories, was referring to the storm that erupted after the New York Post published a video in which he told a private audience that COVID-19, quote, attacks certain races disproportionately and may have been, again, quote, ethnically targeted to do more harm to white and black people than to Ashkenazi Jews and Chinese people. Again, that from the New York Times. The hearing was held by the U.S. House Select Subcommittee on the Weaponization of the Federal Government. And the chair, Congressman Jim Jordan, Republican from Ohio, began by describing why Robert F. Kennedy Jr. was invited to testify.
On the third day of this administration, January 23, 2021, the White House sent an email to Twitter. The email said this: wanted to flag the below tweet, and I'm wondering if we can get moving on the process for having it removed ASAP in all caps. That third day, what did that tweet say? Tweet from Mr. Kennedy said this: Hank Aaron's tragic death is part of a wave of suspicious deaths among elderly closely following administration of the vaccine. He received the vaccine on January 5th to inspire other Black Americans to get the vaccine. Now, what's interesting about the email that the White House sent to Twitter is the subject line says, flagging Hank Aaron misinformation. Now, misinformation is when you don't have the facts right. You're saying things that aren't true. But when you look at Mr. Kennedy's tweet, there was nothing in there that was factually inaccurate. Hank Aaron, real person, great American, passed away after he got the vaccine, just pointing out facts. And yet the White House on the third day was trying, actually 1:04 a.m. on January 23rd, 2021, 37 hours into the administration, they were trying to censor Mr. Kennedy. I find that interesting, the irony here, trying to censor the guy who's actually their Democrat primary opponent. Go figure.
Congressman Jim Jordan, Republican from Ohio, chair of the House Select Subcommittee on the Weaponization of the Federal Government, giving his opening statement at today's hearing. The witness, one of the witnesses, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., also said during his opening statement that he has been censored.
I was censored not just by the Democratic administration, I was censored by the Trump administration. I was the first person censored by as the chairman pointed out, by the Biden administration 2 days after it came into office. It ordered a truthful, and by the way, they had to invent a new word called malinformation to censor people like me. There was no misinformation on my Instagram account. Everything I put on that account was cited and sourced to peer-reviewed publications or government databases. Nobody has ever pointed to a single piece of misinformation that I publish. I was removed for something they called malinformation. Malinformation is information that is true, but is inconvenient to the government, that they don't want people to hear. And that's antithetical to the values of our country. After I announced my presidency, it became more difficult for people to censor me outright. So now I'm subject to this new form of censorship, which is called targeted propaganda, where people apply pejoratives like anti-vax. I've never been anti-vaccine, but everybody in this room probably believes that I have been, because that's the prevailing narrative. Anti-Semitism, racism, these are the most appalling, disgusting pejoratives, and they're applied to me to silence me, because people don't want me to have that conversation about the war, about groceries, about inflation, about the war on the middle class in this country that we need to be having.
Robert F. Kennedy Jr. testifying before a House subcommittee today in Washington, D.C. He is the son of Robert Kennedy, who ran for president in 1968 before he was assassinated, and the nephew to the late President John F. Kennedy and the late Senator Ted Kennedy. At the hearing, Congresswoman Debbie Wasserman Schultz, Democrat from Florida, questioned Robert F. Kennedy Jr. about his recent comments on the COVID-19 vaccine.
Mr. Kennedy, you're well educated. So yes or no, please. Are you aware that for centuries Jews have been scapegoated and blamed for causing illnesses like Black Plague and more recently COVID?
I am. Those are known as blood libel, and they are one of the worst and most disturbing parts of human history.
Good. I'm glad to know that, of course, that you acknowledge that. Of course, it's true and well documented that this pernicious form of anti-Semitism led to centuries of discrimination, even horrific pogroms and massacres, and it still fuels deadly violence today. Yet last week, you floated a baseless conspiracy theory that the coronavirus was bioengineered to target Caucasians and Black people, but to spare Ashkenazi Jews and Chinese people. Mr. Kennedy, your bizarre, unproven claim echoes that same historic slander of labeling Jews and Chinese people as a race, and that Jews, and in this case Chinese people, somehow managed to avoid a deadly illness that targets other groups for death. You do see that, yes or no?
You're misstating.
No. I quoted what you said earlier, and it is directly what you said. So just ask me yes or no.
I was describing an NIH-funded study.
No, you didn't cite any.
I was describing an NIH-funded study by Cleveland Clinic scientists.
Reclaiming my time. You did not reference. Reclaiming my
published
time.
in USC Medical, which is one.
The time is mine. I'm reclaiming it. Please ask the witness to stop talking.
You asked me a question.
Reclaiming.
Allow me to answer my question.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like about 10 seconds back.
The time belongs.
You are slandering me incorrectly.
The time belongs
You're saying is dishonest.
Time belongs to the
I
gentlelady
need
from
time to
Florida.
defend myself.
Mr.
Time
Chairman,
belongs to the gentlelady from Florida.
I'd like 15 seconds back.
We will
Mr.
be happy to
Chairman.
give you that.
Thank you so much. You did not cite any study like you are citing here now during that conversation. You referenced no study at all. You simply labeled Jews and Chinese people as a race, and you also said that somehow they managed to avoid a deadly illness that targets other groups for death. You don't see that? You're trying to rewrite history here.
Congresswoman Debbie Wasserman Schultz, Democrat from Florida, questioning witness Robert F. Kennedy Jr., a Democratic presidential candidate, at today's hearing before the House Select Subcommittee on the Weaponization of the Federal Government. The Congresswoman also tried during the hearing to have it moved to executive session to discuss this witness's alleged, as she put it, violation of the House rule that prohibits testimony that defames or degrades others. She lost that motion in a party line vote. The full House of Representatives passed today a 5-year reauthorization of the Federal Aviation Administration. TheHill.com writes the legislation authorizes $4 billion per fiscal year for the Airport Improvement Program, directs the FAA administrator to draw up a plan to expand the agency's capacity to train air traffic controllers, clarifies language related to ticket refunds for passengers, and addresses safety on runways, among other tenets. That from The Hill. Final vote in the House, 351 to 69, and both the yes votes and the no votes were each split evenly approximately between Republicans and Democrats. Dozens of amendments were debated and voted on before the final vote Wednesday into today, including one from Congressman Burgess Owens, Republican from Utah, that would have added more daily flights to Ronald Reagan Washington National Airport, which is just across the Potomac River from Washington, D.C., used by many members of Congress to travel to and from their home districts. You're going to hear from Congressman Burgess Owens and then opposition from Congressman Don Beyer, Democrat from Virginia.
For 60 years, the federally imposed perimeter rule has limited access and increased costs for Americans flying into Washington Reagan Airport. My amendment is simple. It adds 7 new routes, one for each airline currently operating out of DCA, while preserving all existing flight routes. Congress is long overdue to modernize this arbitrary protectionist federal policy put in place for the economic protection of one airport and one airline. Deliberate misinformation has been circulating widely among my colleagues, and I want to be clear. Our efforts is not about benefiting one airport, one airlines, or any one member of Congress. It's about empowering American consumers by providing more options and greater convenience for people traveling to and from Washington, D.C. For those who have benefited from the monopoly created by the perimeter rule 60 years ago, the message is clear. America, your choices will remain limited and your ticket prices will remain high. I urge my colleagues to support this bipartisan amendment to help DCA fly into the 21st century. I reserve.
The gentleman reserves. For what purpose does the gentleman from Washington rise?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. A claim time in opposition, and with that, I want to recognize Representative from Virginia, Representative Beyer, for 1 minute.
The gentleman's recognized and yields to the gentleman from Virginia for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, thank you very much. Mr. Speaker, I rise in strong opposition to this amendment, falsely advertised as a compromise. No one asked our regional delegation about this, and we were united against adding more air traffic at DCA. DCA is way over capacity. It's the busiest runway in America, one of the shortest, and 25 million people were served last year in an airport designed for 14 million. 20% of the flights are already more than an hour late, and this will only make it worse. This is a congested, complex airspace. Think Capitol, White House, Pentagon, and it is third highest in aborted takeoffs and landings, and these safety concerns will only be magnified. And it is not true that this amendment will lower ticket prices. The last time that the Perimeter Plus slots were added, prices went up at both Dulles and DCA. If you use Reagan National now, count on spending many more hours lost on the tarmac or at the gate. Mr. Speaker, why would you ever vote to make your commute worse? I urge my friends to vote no on this amendment, and I yield back.
Congressman Don Beyer, Democrat from Northern Virginia, and Congressman Burgess Owens offering the amendment, Republican from Utah, on Wednesday, and the House voted Wednesday night to defeat this amendment, 205 to 229. They referred to the perimeter rule. DCA, or Washington National Airport, is the only airport in the country, subject to a federally imposed rule that restricts inbound and outbound nonstop flights to 1,250-mile radius. Another amendment to the FAA reauthorization bill would have cut the Essential Air Service, or EAS, program that supports airports in rural areas. You're going to hear from Congressman Scott Perry, Republican from Pennsylvania, favoring this, and then Congressman Lloyd Smucker, Republican from Pennsylvania, in opposition.
This is a nearly 50-year-old temporary program. It's indicative of everything in Washington. Nothing ever dies here. We just spend more and more money. But the DOT literally picks winners and losers, where neighboring airports have to compete against the federal government, who subsidizes routes for the very same market. Approved subsidies include funding leisure routes. That's not essential. That's leisure. Flights on EAS routes are relatively empty compared to non-subsidized flights, and the obvious outcome of subsidizing these routes, they're not economically viable. That's why they're subsidized. It's because no one really needs them. There are other options that are reasonable. The industry continues to suffer from a pilot shortage, a mechanic shortage, labor all across the board, an ATC, etc. And all we're doing is making it worse by misallocating these resources. Pilots are flying planes to places where there aren't any customers, and they're canceling routes where people need to fly. The bill does make significant improvements. However, the program remains inherently unfair and represents a significant misallocation of resources at a time when we can ill afford to do so. I urge adoption. I thank the gentleman. I yield.
I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from California reserves. The gentleman from South Dakota is recognized.
I would yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Smucker.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in opposition to this amendment. I respect the intent of the author of this amendment, Mr. McClintock, who I respect very much, and I agree with his desire to cut wasteful government programs, but we just have a fundamental disagreement of the value of this program. Speaking for my community, and I do represent Lancaster Airport, this service allows my constituents to connect with Pittsburgh and another major airport where they can link with routes to take them across the country. Every dollar invested into the program yields a great return. Lancaster Airport is the 3rd busiest airport in Pennsylvania behind Philadelphia and Pittsburgh. This is an important link to keep it a strong commercial hub and to service our community. But EAS also serves 172 airports across the country, and if this amendment gets adopted, many of those communities would lose their airports. Losing EAS eligibility will not only disconnect communities in rural areas from the National Air Service, but it also have a ripple economic effect. Again, I commend the author of this, and I commend the chairman for the changes that have been made to this program, but it's important we keep it. Thank you.
Congressman Lloyd Smucker, Republican from Pennsylvania, responding to Congressman Scott Perry, Republican from Pennsylvania. Debate on the House floor on Wednesday, and on Wednesday night, the House defeated the Perry-McClintock amendment, both offered it, by a vote of 49 yes to 386 no. A few more results from amendments to the FAA reauthorization bill over the past 2 days in the House. One that would have required airlines to reinstate pilots who were fired or forced to resign because of vaccine mandates. That failed, 141 to 294. Another one restricting funding for diversity, equity, and inclusion officials or training at the FAA. That failed, 181 to 254. Again, debate and votes for the past 2 days, and today the House passed the final amended version of the 5-year reauthorization bill for the FAA, 351 to 69, sending it to the Senate. Washington Today continues in a moment.
Since 1979, in partnership with the cable industry, C-SPAN has provided complete coverage of the halls of Congress, from the House and Senate floors to congressional hearings, party briefings, and committee meetings. C-SPAN gives you a front row seat to how issues are debated and decided, with no commentary, no interruptions, and completely unfiltered. C-SPAN, your unfiltered view of government.
When citizens are truly informed, our republic thrives. Get informed straight from the source on C-SPAN. Unfiltered, unbiased, word for word. from the nation's capital to wherever you are. Because the opinion that matters the most is your own. This is what democracy looks like. C-SPAN, powered by cable.
Welcome back to Washington Today, available as a podcast wherever you get your podcasts and on the C-SPAN Now mobile app. President Joe Biden traveled to Philadelphia today to promote clean energy manufacturing and the creation of union jobs. On the flight up from Washington, D.C. on Air Force One, the Principal Deputy White House Press Secretary Olivia Dalton spoke to reporters about the agenda.
In Philadelphia, the president will visit the Philly shipyard for a steel cutting ceremony for the Acadia, a vessel that will be used to help build offshore wind farms. The Acadia and the offshore wind farms it will help build are expected to support hundreds of new union jobs. The company building the Acadia, called Great Lakes Dredge and Dock, has stated that it would not have entered the growing U.S. offshore wind market were it not for the Biden-Harris administration's clean energy policies. While in Philadelphia at the steel cutting, the president will also announce the first ever offshore wind sale in the Gulf of Mexico. In Philadelphia, the president will be joined by Congresswoman Mary Gay Scanlon, Philadelphia Mayor Jim Kenney, as well as Representatives Brendan Boyle, Madeline Dean, Chrissy Houlihan, Donald Norcross, and Joe Courtney.
The Principal Deputy White House Press Secretary Olivia Dalton briefing reporters on Air Force One. The White House says the wind energy lease in the Gulf of Mexico will create enough clean energy to power 1.3 million homes. At the Philly shipyard in Philadelphia, after that steel cutting ceremony, President Biden gave a speech.
When I took office, I set a goal of producing 30 gigawatts of offshore energy wind by 2030. 30 gigawatts is enough to power 10 million homes. It'll help put us on a path to 100% clean energy by 2035. By 2035, all of the electricity you turn in is all going to be clean energy. It's not hypothetical. Construction is already underway in two major projects off the East Coast. And just within the last month, the Department of Interior advanced permitting on two more wind projects in the East Coast. And here in the Philly shipyard, Great Lakes Dredge and Dock is also stepping up to help meet the clean energy goals. Here today, workers in 9 different unions will start building a vessel called the Acadia. It's going to place heavy rocks at the base of the offshore wind projects to stabilize them when they put these down. And it's going to protect it against erosion. Be the first vessel of its kind that's made in America, American-owned, American-operated. And the rocks will come from American quarries. And it'll be loaded at American ports. Steel for vessels being made by the United States steelworkers in Indiana. The engine will be made in the United States electrical, radio, and machine workers in Pittsburgh. The crew is going to be American Marine mariners from Seafarers International Union. The turbines themselves will be as tall as the buildings in Center City, Philadelphia. That's how big they are. And the blades, 110 yards long. I went to see them being made in Colorado. It's breathtaking. And I might add, notwithstanding what the other guy said, windmills do not cause cancer.
President Biden at the Philly shipyard in Philadelphia. A Philadelphia Inquirer article about the speech has this. President Biden highlighted a campaign ad featuring an outspoken Republican critic, Georgia Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene. The ad, featuring only her own words, uses comments she made at the Turning Point Action Conference comparing President Biden to Franklin D. Roosevelt and Lyndon B. Johnson. She intended to be critical. The ad had been viewed more than 40 million times, according to Twitter. And President Biden joked, according to this article in the Inquirer, "I never had an endorsement from her before." Wall Street today, the Dow up 163, NASDAQ down 294, S&P down 30. The Senate, writes the Washington Examiner, voted on Thursday to bar China from purchasing oil from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve in an effort to protect the U.S. emergency stockpile after it was drained to a 40-year low. Lawmakers voted 85-14 to pass the legislation, which was introduced by Senators Ted Cruz, Republican from Texas, and Joe Manchin, Democrat from West Virginia, as an amendment to the National Defense Authorization Act. The legislation would ban the sale of SPR oil to any company under the control of the Chinese Communist Party or to Russia, Iran, North Korea, or any country sanctioned by the United States. That from the Washington Examiner. Here's some debate before the Senate vote. Senator Ted Cruz, and opposing the amendment, Senator Christopher Murphy, Democrat from Connecticut.
This amendment would prevent the sale of our nation's emergency crude oil stockpile, the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, to 4 countries who are unequivocally U.S. adversaries. We know that China has been amassing the largest stockpile of crude in the world. At the same time, our own reserves have fallen to only 347 million barrels, the lowest since 1983. Last year, the United States sold off part of our reserves to China. One would think that existing law would prevent this, but that isn't yet the case. For some time now, Senator Manchin and I have been working together to try to fix this issue. Our amendment prevents the federal government from selling oil from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve to China, to Russia, to Iran, or to North Korea and their related entities, while giving the Department of Energy flexibility to waive these restrictions in the event doing so serves our national security interests. I want to thank Senator Manchin for working closely with me on this amendment, and also Senators Ernst and Fetterman. And I also want to note briefly, I know there are some members of this body that believe we should ban all oil sales overseas. I would note doing so would be spectacularly harmful, not only to U.S. interests, but it would also hurt our friends and allies. It would hurt Ukraine, it would hurt Europe, and it would benefit our enemies, including Russia, to force our friends to have to purchase oil from Russia. I urge adoption of the amendment, and I yield the floor.
Mr. President, I rise to oppose this amendment. I want to tell my colleagues why. This amendment creates the illusion of solving a problem while having very little political impact and likely doing more harm than good. It is a legitimate worry to consider the amount of U.S. oil under our lands that goes and is shipped to China. Because in 2022, the United States did export over 83 million barrels of oil to China. Now, that was a new record. It was a new record in part because 10 years ago, we didn't ship any oil overseas because we had a national security policy to keep U.S. oil here. But lobbying by the oil industry changed that policy, and so today we're sending 83 million barrels of oil a year to China. But this amendment doesn't really change that, because you want to know how much of that comes from the SPR? Less than 2 million barrels, 1 to 2%. And so you are still going to have 80 million plus barrels of oil from the private sector being sent to China every year. Now, ExxonMobil alone made $60 billion in profits last year, much of that off sales of oil to China. And this amendment allows for the oil industry to keep making those billions off of selling oil to China, only stripping out sales from the SPR. Now, that's a great deal for the oil industry, but it gets better. When President Biden sold oil from the SPR last year, it helped cut the cost of a gallon of gasoline by up to 30 cents. Now, that hurt oil industry profits. And so, of course, the oil industry wants policies that restrict the sale of oil from the SPR while letting them sell oil to whoever they want, including China.
Senator Christopher Murphy, Democrat from Connecticut, and before that, one of the sponsors of the amendment, Senator Ted Cruz, Republican from Texas. The Senate went on to pass this amendment, 85-14, and add it to the National Defense Authorization Act bill, or NDAA. Senate also voted on an amendment today from Senator Mike Lee, Republican from Utah, that would limit the availability of U.S. funds to Ukraine until NATO member countries spend at least 2% of their GDP on defense. That failed by a vote of 13-71. Debate and votes on more amendments to the NDAA and then final passage expected in the Senate next week. The White House says Russia may be planning false flag operations to justify attacks on civilian ships around Ukrainian ports in the Black Sea. This follows Russia's attacks this week on grain facilities in the Ukrainian port city of Odessa And that followed Russia's withdrawal from the United Nations agreement that had allowed safe passage of ships carrying Ukrainian grain. White House National Security Council spokesperson John Kirby told reporters today in a virtual briefing about some declassified information.
Since Monday, Russia has now spent 3 straight nights striking and bombing Ukrainian port cities, destroying agricultural infrastructure, and quite frankly, tens of thousands, some 60,000 tons of grain. We have some additional information, which again, we talked a little bit about last night, that we want to share, and that's that the Russian military may expand their targeting of Ukrainian grain facilities to include attacks against civilian shipping in the Black Sea. Russia has already announced publicly that all ships proceeding to Ukrainian ports in Black Sea waters will be considered potential carriers of military cargo, even though they are simply trying to pick up grain and food to be able to feed people around the world. Our information indicates that Russia has laid additional sea mines in the approaches to Ukrainian ports. And yesterday, we observed Russia release a video of the detection and detonation of what they claimed was a Ukrainian sea mine. We believe that this is rather a coordinated effort to justify any attacks against civilian ships in the Black Sea and to then blame them on Ukraine in what we would consider and have in the past talked about considering a false flag operation. So it's obviously something we're going to be watching very, very closely, but we felt it was important to sound that warning and to make that clear what we're seeing and what we believe Russia's really up to here in the northern Black Sea.
John Kirby is Strategic Communications Coordinator for the White House National Security Council, part of his audio-only virtual briefing today with reporters. The Pentagon says that North Korean officials have not responded to U.S. outreach on the fate of Army Private Travis King. An Associated Press article has this: Private King was supposed to be returned to the U.S. this week to face military discipline after serving nearly 2 months in a South Korean prison on assault charges. But instead of boarding a flight for Texas on Monday as planned, he slipped away and quietly joined a civilian tour group on Tuesday morning, headed for the demilitarized zone that divides South and North Korea. A question today to the Defense Department Deputy Press Secretary Sabrina Singh.
Can you say any more about the efforts being made to contact North Korea either directly or through intermediaries? Is it a matter of making the calls and just no one's picking up on the other end? There's no sign of any response at all so far?
Unfortunately, no. There is no sign of engagement from the North Koreans. We don't have, we've always maintained that we want to have diplomatic channels remain open. We've always wanted to ensure that there is military-to-military cooperation and communication, but sadly, there's not on the North Korean side. You've heard from my NSC counterparts that there has been engagement at their level to Sweden and other interagency efforts to try and engage North Korea, but we just have not heard back on this issue.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Deputy Press Secretary at the Pentagon, Sabrina Singh, on Private Travis King of the U.S. Army, who earlier this week ran from South Korea to North Korea across the DMZ. A CBS News article says that over the past 3 decades, 11 U.S. citizens were detained having accidentally or on purpose entered North Korea illegally. All of them were eventually released, though some required high-level diplomatic intervention. Since then, times have changed, writes the article. Diplomatic intervention has become virtually impossible since North Korea sealed its borders at the start of the pandemic. Almost all foreign officials were forced to leave the country. That includes representatives from Sweden, the protecting power for the United States in the north, who could have lobbied for access to Travis King. Even though as a private he has limited intelligence value to the North Koreans, Travis King is bound to be debriefed by state security. That from CBS News. An article from Reuters: the United States on Thursday strongly condemned the attack on the Swedish embassy in Baghdad over a planned Koran burning in Stockholm, and criticized Iraq's security forces for not preventing protesters from breaching the diplomatic post. Freedom of peaceful assembly is an essential hallmark of democracy, but what occurred last night was an unlawful act of violence, said State Department spokesperson Matthew Miller. That's reporting from Reuters. And more from Matthew Miller's briefing today.
I saw your statement on the protesters in Iraq and condemning the attacking on the Swedish embassy in Baghdad. Do you have any reaction to the Iraqi Prime Minister's decision to expel the Swedish ambassador in Baghdad?
I would say that we would urge restraint and open dialogue between our partners, Sweden and Iraq, on this issue.
And then what's your comment to the Muqtada al-Sadr's comments today? He said that I will talk to the American. The U.S. is the country of terrorism and homosexuality country, and they are not allowed to condemning us. Do you have any comments on this?
Who made that comment?
Muqtada al-Sadr, he is the Shiite cleric.
I don't think I would have any comment on that other than what was he specifically reacting to with that comment?
To your statement that you're condemning Iraq on the protests,
on the protests. Well, I don't have any specific reaction to him, obviously, than to say that we strongly condemn the attack on the Swedish embassy in Baghdad, and there is no place for violence and violations of law.
State Department spokesperson Matthew Miller at his briefing. Thanks for listening to Washington Today. Subscribe to C-SPAN's evening newsletter word for word to get the stories Washington is talking about emailed to you every day. Subscribe at c-span.org/connect. Have a good night.